Welcome, everybody, to the Center for Citizen Peacebuilding's Hal Smith Lecture Series. My name is Daniel Brunstetter. I'm professor in the Political Science Department here at UC Irvine and the current director of the Center for Citizen Peacebuilding. Since 1999, the center has worked with ordinary citizens to prevent violent conflict and to explore paths to sustainable peace and reconciliation across the world. The center has conducted research, advanced education in peace and conflict resolution, and organized efforts to improve and expand citizen peacebuilding in the US and across the globe. It's my distinct pleasure today to introduce Ambassador Jack Matlock, PhD. His talk, entitled Distorted Visions, How We Ended the Cold War and Lost the Peace, is part of the center's Hal Smith Lecture Series. The talk will be followed by a question and answer session. We will be taking questions for the audience from the Q&A function, so please write your questions there, and we'll do our best to get through them as time permits. During his 35 years in the American Foreign Service, dating back from 1956 to 1991, Ambassador Matlock has held many fascinating and important positions. Notably, he served as ambassador to the Soviet Union from 1987 to 1991. Prior to this, he was Special Assistant to the President for National Security Affairs and Senior Director for European and Soviet Affairs on the National Security Council staff. And he was Ambassador to Czechoslovakia as well. Before his appointment to Moscow as ambassador, Mr. Matlock served 3 tours at the American Embassy in the Soviet Union, as well as Foreign Service assignments in Vienna, Munich, Accra, Zanzibar, and Dar es Salaam. Since his retirement from the Foreign Service in 1991, he has held academic posts at Columbia University, Princeton University, Hamilton College, Mount Holyoke College, and the Institute for Advanced Study, where he was the George F. Kennan Professor. Since 2015, he has been a visiting scholar at Duke University. Ambassador Matlock is the author of numerous articles and books, and to name just one that caught my eye, this one, Superpower Illusions, How Myths and False Ideologies Led America Astray, and How to Return to Reality, published with Yale University Press in 2010. Thank you very much, Ambassador, for joining us this afternoon. We're very much looking forward to your talk.
Thank you very much for those kind words and for the invitation to join you. I warmly remember my visit there over a decade ago when I was received with a truly warm welcome. And I only regret I can't be there in person today. But I am very happy that you let me discuss with you the problems that I think we face today in our foreign policy. When the Cold War ended in the late 80s, and then the Soviet Union broke up, we thought on the road to a world that would be largely peaceful. But today, we find still in conflict, serious conflict that the United States itself is involved in some respects. And I have to ask, how is it? How is it that I'm trying to move the PowerPoint, excuse me. I'll have to see how I get it's not responding to my advance.
Try clicking a couple times on the PowerPoint, that might help it.
But, all right.
Click on the PowerPoint a few times, it may help.
PowerPoint, so, oh yes. So how is it we've moved? And just over 3 decades from the confidence that enveloped us when the Cold War ended, the Berlin Wall came down, and President George H.W. Bush proclaimed a new world order to the war in Ukraine today. Well, there undoubtedly are a number of reasons. But you know, one of the most fundamental is that we failed as a nation to understand the lessons the end of the Cold War and the collapse of the Soviet Union should have taught us. We tend to think of, oh, we won the Cold War. And the proof of that is the Soviet Union broke up. Actually, that has led us, I think, to a fundamental misunderstanding of what happened. Yes, first of all, the Cold War ended. And this happened in 1988-89. Then the Communist Party lost control of the Soviet Union. And that happened sort of gradually between 89 and 91. And then in December 1991, the Soviet Union shattered into 15 independent states. Now, these events were connected, but still they were separate. And the misunderstanding, I think, has been at the root of some of our mistakes later. First of all, the Cold War ended not in the victory, quasi-military victory of one country over another, but it ended by negotiation. And it ended by negotiation that produced benefits for everybody, because we ended a very dangerous and costly arms race. And we also were able to liberate much of Eastern Europe, which had been dominated by the Soviet Union. But that ended before the second thing happened. That was when the Communist Party lost control of the Soviet Union, when Gorbachev maneuvered it out of control with democratic reforms. And he did so when the Communist Party began to resist his reforms. This happened not because of Western pressure. It happened because of things that were going on inside the Soviet Union. And then the third of these, what I consider almost geopolitically seismic events, the Soviet Union shattered into 15 independent states. And that's when the Russian President Yeltsin conspired with the leaders of Ukraine and Belarus to dissolve the Soviet Union. Actually, that was not a victory for American policy in any sense, because the United States hoped Gorbachev would create a voluntary federation of Soviet republics other than Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. Now, how did the first part of that come about, the end of the Cold War? Was it a matter of we bringing great pressure on the Soviet Union and then it did simply collapse? Many people think that. Not at all. It was done because we changed our negotiating posture during Ronald Reagan's administration. And instead of simply trying to bring pressure to bear and making demands upon them, we decided to try to seek cooperations, not capitulation, to offer reciprocity on the problems, to consult privately in advance to try to find out where we could agree, to understand the political position and the political needs of the other leader, and to stay in touch, communicate constantly. We did not walk away from negotiations, and if there was a crisis or something unpleasant happened, we did not refuse to talk to the other side. And explicitly, we, although this was in a memorandum for the bureaucracy and was at the time secret, we excluded from our aims any challenging the legitimacy of the Soviet system, trying to secure military superiority, or, and most important, forcing the collapse of the Soviet system. We wanted to change their behavior abroad, where they were oppressing others. And although we thought that communism was a lousy system and not even good for Russia, that was their business. And as far as we were concerned, if they would keep it at home, that we were not trying to change them. And of course, we thought communism was a bad system and they would be better off without it. But we knew that if we take that position as sort of a hostile way, we're actually going to strengthen the system and strengthen their resistance. Now, actually, with these negotiations, Gorbachev began to change the Soviet Union. And most basically, he simply discarded the Marxist-Leninist philosophy that had been the motivation of the revolution and had been their basic ideology throughout the Soviet Union. And instead of basing his foreign policy on the interests of what they called the proletariat, he declared that they would base it on the common interest of the mankind, not the class struggle. And he also added, this is in his UN speech in December 1988, that countries have a freedom of choice of a political system and alliances. He also reduced the Soviet military. Then the Berlin Wall was taken down because Gorbachev actually withdrew his support from the communist government and was pressing them to reform. Therefore, it came down. And then when he met George H.W. Bush at Malta in December, they agreed that we no longer consider each other enemies. And it was also agreed that the Soviet Union will not intervene in Eastern Europe. The United States said it would not take advantage of changes there. And then there were many issues that we were dealing with, but none was more crucial or more important than the negotiations for the unification of Germany. Germany had been divided initially by what had been the occupation zones of the United States, France, and Great Britain in the West, and that of the Soviet Union in the East. They had established a separate state, the German Democratic Republic, and this was considered by the Soviet leaders as one of the few fruits of the victory in World War II. But very quickly, when the Germans began in the East Germany to demonstrate and try to change things, we began to negotiate the terms. And initially, the Soviet Union said that, well, if we agree to German unification, and they had a right as one of the victors of World War II to veto this, but if we agree, Germany has to leave NATO. And in negotiating that, it seemed to us and most of our allies that it was important to keep Germany in NATO. And our Secretary of State told Gorbachev in February 1990, assuming there's no expansion of NATO to the east, not 1 inch. Then he went on to say, wouldn't it be better, even for the Soviet Union, to have a united Germany stay in NATO? Well, there was finally an agreement signed on September 12, 1990, called the 2+4 Agreement for the unification of Germany. It did not have in that treaty a prohibition of expanding NATO, but it placed conditions on the territory of East Germany that they could not have foreign military bases or nuclear weapons stationed in them. So it was a conditional withdrawal. Now, the second geopolitical transformation, and I'll have to go quickly over this, is that the Communist Party lost control of the USSR. That's something almost nobody was predicting at the time. And it happened because Gorbachev, first the General Secretary of the Soviet Union, of the Communist Party, and then subsequently President of the Soviet Union, simply lost the party, the Communist Party, which he ruled, lost control. Parts that they claimed, beginning with Lithuania, started declaring independence. Independence movements were growing in other non-Russian republics. And then in August 1991, there was an attempt to remove Gorbachev, and that so weakened, although it failed, that so weakened them that it began to break up. And the breakup occurred finally on December 25th, when, in fact, the president of Russia at that time, the Russian Federation, which was a part of the Soviet Union, when their elected leader, Boris Yeltsin, met with leaders from Ukraine and Belarus and simply declared that the Soviet Union was no more. And it was on Christmas Day, 1991, that the Russian tricolor replaced the hammer and sickle. Now, so in 1992, Europe was free, undivided. There was economic collapse in Russia, Ukraine, and most of the ex-Soviet republics. The United States and the West declared victory, as if the breakup was a victory. It certainly wasn't in the minds of President Bush at the time, who had actually gone so far in September of 1991 as to advise the Ukrainian parliament not to pursue independence, but to join in a voluntary federation with that Gorbachev was doing. But nevertheless, many people thinking with those, I would say, three seismic changes that had occurred in just a very few years, unpredicted by almost everybody, they suddenly declared it as a victory and a license to make the world over. It's very characteristic, one of the most, I would say, important of the philosophical discussions at that time was in Francis Fukuyama's well-known book, The End of History and the Last Man. The quote I have here, think about this. What we may be witnessing is not just the end of the Cold War or the passing of a particular period of post-war history, but the end of history as such. That is the end point of mankind's ideological evolution and the universalization of Western liberal democracy as the final form of human government. Wow. You know, when I read that, I thought, what is he saying? It sounds to me that though a few words are different, he's saying what Marx and Lenin and Stalin were saying, that the future is going to be revolutionary, that what they call the proletariat was going to take over, and that the whole world was going to have what they call socialist or communist governments. Well, That's what the events of the preceding years had simply shown not true. It also reminded me of what we call the Brezhnev Doctrine, because in the latter years of the Soviet Union, when the Soviet Union intervened in Hungary and Czechoslovakia and to restore a communist rule, that it was the duty of what they call socialist states collectively to defend socialism from internal or external threats. And then what became what I believe was a unipolar illusion, that it was now the ability and a duty of the United States to spread democracy and maintain what was called a liberal world order. Now, let me say that, of course, we want democracy, and of course, we would like other countries to have it. But can we spread it for other people? I think the only effective way you can spread democracy in the world is to show how it works at home and the benefits of it. There is no way that an outsider can create a government of, for, and by the people of another country. They have to do it for themselves. So, and then what is a liberal world order? Of course, we would like to see a world order where everybody abides by agreed rules. But we have to question as we look forward as to whether American policy has actually merited that thing. Another idea was that, well, there had been two superpowers in the world, and now there was only one. Yes, both the United States and the Soviet Union had enough nuclear weapons actually prepared to be launched at a moment's notice to destroy each other and most of the rest of the world. So it's unlimited power to destroy. But is it much else? Can it be used creatively? I don't think so. So I think there was a misunderstanding, and I would say that there are still two countries that can destroy the world with their nuclear weapons, the United States and Russia. We often forget that. Well, let me quickly go through the Clinton administration. I thought missed an opportunity. First of all, there was no real strategy for a post-Cold War world. And then arms reduction stalled. We had no new real agreements. There was no Middle East peace, although we came very close to it when there was a mediation by Norway between the Palestinian leaders and Israel. But that wasn't pushed until right at the end of his administration, and it fell apart. The NATO expansion left Russia out of European security. And it was the decision late in his administration that President Clinton started that process against the advice of virtually all of us who had been involved in ending the Cold War. Then there was a war against Serbia without UN Security Council approval. And the change of borders by creating an independent Kosovo, and this violated an earlier political commitment not to change borders without mutual agreement of both countries. By the way, this is a precedent which President Putin has used to justify his actions in Ukraine. Our defense posture wasn't really changed as a result of the Cold War end. We just kept doing the same things, but just giving them different reasons. But probably as far as our relations with Russia was concerned, the extension beginning to extend NATO to include countries of Eastern Europe when they were in no way threatened by Russia was, I think, a fateful policy. But if he missed opportunities, his successor, George W. Bush, destroyed them. He was asleep at the switch when Al-Qaeda attacked. I could talk a long time about that, but the fact is, he was warned 3 times that Al-Qaeda was planning an attack on the United States, and he did nothing to alert the US officials who could have prevented it, and it could have been prevented. Then he attacked Iraq without UN Security Council approval or solid alliance support when Iraq was no threat to us, and actually lied about the intelligence in doing so. He walked away from important treaties such as the ABM Treaty, which had been the very basis of our ending the Cold War. He dropped verification of nuclear reductions, seemed to proclaim an intent simply to dominate the world. He turned a budgetary surplus into a deficit and financed his wars by borrowing off the budget. He presided over a real estate and financial boom that burst in 2007, 2008, and made the United States the world's largest debtor. And then Russia began to be a problem rather than an ally. Although just after the 9/11 attacks, Vladimir Putin was the first foreign leader to call Bush after the attacks. He helped us when we decided to go into Afghanistan by giving overflight rights, by sharing intelligence. In return, we left the ABM Treaty, as I mentioned. We continued expanding NATO eastward and even tried to bring Ukraine into NATO against the wishes of the Ukrainians. At that time, 2/3 of the Ukrainians did not want to be in NATO. So by 2007, Putin was fed up and stopped pretending to continue the US with the power. And he made these points in a speech in Munich in 2007, objecting to what he called US monopolistic dominance in world politics and, quote, almost uncontained hyper use of force. Now, then there was great expectation when President Obama took office that he would correct some of these things. And indeed, he did start strong in terms of battle, and he did a lot to restore respect for the United States in the world. But as they began to deal with Russia, it seemed that his advisors were not very familiar with the Russian language or how to deal with the Soviet Union. At the first, when the Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton, made her first visit to Russia, they were announced they wanted to reset relationships. And they actually had a big button printed in Latin letters, not the Russian Cyrillic, Pedigruska, to emphasize this. Well, guess what? Pedigruska in Russian doesn't mean reset, it means overload. And the word for reset is Pedizagruska. And you know, one can say that maybe this was simply a Freudian slip. Not only did it show a lack of accurate knowledge of the Russian language on the part of her advisors, it also showed, I believe, that they really thought you could have contradictory ends in your policy. So because we started cooperating when we thought our interests coincided, but then we began actively supporting what we considered democratic forces and Western values within Russia, even though these were opponents of the government there, and particularly to get involved in the politics and even a formation of governments in countries that had broken off from the Soviet Union. And specifically, they denied Russia any sphere of influence in its own neighborhood. And increasingly, the policy seemed aimed at President Putin personally. They made one important agreement that was called New START, and it was probably the most important renewal of the arms control negotiations. Let me say that that until just a few days ago was the only operative arms control agreement still extant with the United States, and President Putin, because of the US involvement in the war in Ukraine, has now suspended it. So, but anyway, this was certainly an achievement. But to sum up the Russian view of US policy at that time, I'm now talking about during the Obama administration, was that the US was seeking world domination and using the word leadership as a euphemism, that democratization was simply used to unseat governments not under US domination. And for example, when the uprisings in several Arab countries started, we started talking about the Arab Spring, as if overthrow of the government was going to bring about automatically democracy. You know, to me, that was rather puzzling, because during the Cold War, anytime there were attempts to change governments, we thought they were apt to become communist, and we would try to put them down, particularly if they were in Latin America. But, and then we started a policy to bring Ukraine and Georgia into NATO, which would have created a ring of military bases around Russia. And the US missile defenses, which we began to deploy in Europe, supposedly to defend against Europe against missiles from Iran, seemed rather to be there to be used against Russia, because Iran at that point had no missiles and no incentive for attacking Europe. And then the US media became, I think, pretty thoroughly Russophobic, criticizing virtually everything, exaggerating faults, and so on. So it seemed to the Russians that our aim was to humiliate the Russian leaders and to encourage regime change, that is, the removal of the President Putin. Now, frankly, no matter how bad a person is, for political leaders, personal invective never helps. And I would just say that, for example, although President Reagan hated communism, criticized it very much, and would talk about hostile rhetoric, he never once publicly tried to humiliate or criticize personally a Soviet leader, or rather, and when he would meet them, his first words would be, "We hold the peace of the world in our hands. We must be responsible." Now, Ukraine, the big issue today. Just a few things I'll have to skip through, but we have to bear in mind. First of all, the borders of Ukraine that Ukraine obtained in 1991 when the Soviet Union broke up had been put together over time. And most recently, the part here called Galicia had been brought in by Stalin. It had been largely part of Poland earlier and brought in by effectively after the Second World War. The Crimea, which is entirely, not entirely, but largely Russian speaking, was brought in by Khrushchev simply by a stroke of the pen. Historically, it had never been part of Ukraine. That's one thing to bear in mind. Second, that Ukraine is very much divided in terms of languages. Here we have largely Russian spoken in the east and south, and Ukraine in the center and west. Third, voting in Ukraine followed these lines very much, so that you get candidates getting 80, 85% here, the other candidates getting the same amount over here. And all right, you can find other countries that are linguistically divided. I think Belgium, for example, or if you really want one that's really divided, Switzerland. What about all these countries that are successful? Though they may have stresses, they give the same language rights to all of their citizens. But this became an issue along with others. But the problem here also was that if a president is elected, the president appoints the governors of all the provinces. And therefore, there is no autonomy where you can have sort of the maximum autonomy in your everyday life. So that was the structure, because usually countries with different faiths or sometimes different languages try to develop, at least in local affairs, the maximum autonomy and certainly rights to use their language. Now, the present situation, the roots of it, the immediate roots of it, were in what we call the Ukraine's Maidan Revolution 2014. Now, that happened that President Yanukovych, a very corrupt president, but one who had been elected president, fled when violence erupted in Kiev after long demonstrations. He was replaced by a government which had been openly promoted by US officials. Then there was a rebellion of Russian speakers in the Donbass, where heavily Russian populated, and they declared secession from Ukraine. At the same time, Russia held a referendum in Crimea, and when there was an overwhelming vote to join Russia, it transferred that peninsula to Russia legally. Then also Russia supported the secession from Ukraine and the formation of what they called sort of independent states there. But then Ukraine attempted to retake the rebellious areas of the Donbass by force, and the United States began to sanction Russia, particularly over the annexation of Crimea. Now, it should be noted that there's no question that the majority of the people in Crimea are Russians, and that almost certainly it was, the will of the people there. And we also tended to forget that the United States itself had separated Kosovo from Serbia without Serbia's approval, and did not even have a plebiscite or voting on the basis of that. So that although we took actions against Russia for that, we had unfortunately, as far as the Russian attitude is concerned, had set a precedent for it. Now, the Trump years, well, relations didn't improve despite Trump's earlier comments about working with Putin. The Russiagate emotions, the whole Russiagate thing really had no basis because the met a few things Russia did on the internet and had no effect on the actual election of Trump. But we spent a lot of emotions talking about Russiagate, making accusations which actually never panned out, which tended to block any real cooperation. And very important that we began to expel each other's diplomats, something started by the United States in the last month of the Obama administration, to the point that right now they are virtually strangled. We have so few people in our embassy in Moscow, and they have so few in Washington, that we can't even issue visas there anymore. And we also had principal US media, which seemed to pick up every Russophobic theme they could in an information war. Now, where are we now? I'll try to bring this to a conclusion. I think we're in a very bad situation for every country involved, because there really can be no victors in the war in Ukraine. And the longer the fighting, the more people will be killed and the more damage to the international system. The goal we seem to have of weakening Russia is not in our interest, but it has convinced many Russians who otherwise would be opposed to the invasion of Ukraine, that nevertheless they have to continue because they're fighting not Russia, but the United States and NATO, which is determined to dominate the area. The challenges of the future, to name a few: global warming, threat of pandemics, failed states, terrorism, refugee flows, require the cooperation of all countries, especially the largest and the most populous. And to fight over where borders are drawn would be to repeat the mistake of the First World War. So the longer the war in Ukraine continues, the more likely weapons of mass destruction will be employed. So let me go back to another theme. Why, in my mind, what we call the liberal world order is really simply a change, a refashioning of what the Soviets had as the Brezhnev doctrine. We think democracy and market capitalism is the future of mankind. Well, I hope it is. But when we think it's the duty to spread it, we sometimes do more harm than good to those ends. Now, it does seem to me that our policy, foreign and domestic, is in many respects not serving the national interest, to put it mildly. We seem to be trapped in never-ending wars. Okay, we ended one in Afghanistan, but we're in many other places. We're politically split at home into antagonistic factions. We're tied to allies, quote unquote, whose interests are not the same as ours. We're estranged from potential partners, and our current policy threatens a new nuclear arms race at best, and nuclear war at worst. Now, our fallacy has become much too concentrated on militarism and the use of force to solve problems. We need to learn from history, and one important lesson we should, which should become almost a catechism. The future of the world, and indeed mankind, will not be determined by geopolitical competition or control of territory. The most serious challenges transcend national boundaries and can be managed or overcome only by international cooperation. So this idea that seems to penetrate much of our thinking, that first of all, control of land and people equals strength, it doesn't. You try to control people who don't want you to control them, it's a weakness. And the idea that Ukraine could possibly take back Crimea when most of the people there don't want to be in Ukraine, and Russia has a vital to it naval base there, is a sheer illusion. Now, another thing is that goal should be to maximize power. Power for what? You got to ask that, because you can get too big, and that's sort of like saying the more weight you put on, the better you will be. Well, we know very well that probably isn't true. And we should not think of power as a hierarchy. At times, President Obama would say, well, Russia is not a great power anymore. Does that mean that only great powers have rights? Does that mean that might makes right? It would seem that to many outsiders. And rivalry for control of territory benefits nobody. It damages or destroys the area fought over. This is certainly true of Ukraine today. It is simply being damaged, and nobody is suffering more than the Ukrainians over the situation. And finally, military force cannot create democracy in another country. One of the most, I would say, ill-founded ideas I hear is that we have to support the Ukrainians because they are a democracy. Ukraine is no more a democracy than Russia. Both Ukraine and Russia have democratic constitutions, but they are circumscribed in various ways to produce a result that is more authoritarian than really democratic. But the idea that this is defending democracy is simply ridiculous. It's making democracy in other areas impossible. So I would just generalize, as we think about things, remember when we use theories that are simplistic, that, well, the devil is in the details. You need to look at what's behind it. Are we defending democracy when we send arms to Ukraine? I think not. Labels, what do they distort or obscure? Particularly when we use terms like democracy. Are we a democracy? I was taught that we are a republic, and which step by step has historically become more democratic. But we have, in my lifetime, and in most of yours, for twice elected presidents who had many fewer votes than their opponent. Is that democratic? And metaphors, do they really fit? It's so easy to say, oh, well, we've got to stop Putin because we didn't stop Hitler. But these are two entirely different situations when you look at them. And frankly, the situation today looks to me more like 1914 than 1938. And so is this Munich 38 or Europe 1914? looks more like the latter to me than the former. And finally, nations interact through people. Human psychology is more important than political theory. You don't get anywhere by demonizing other countries' leaders, particularly when they control powerful instruments in their own country. And so I think that those are general things. I believe that my time is up, and there are more on this that if you wish to look through later. But what I would say now is that I do think that our current policies have put us in a position where until we begin to try to end fighting whenever it occurs, rather than backing one side or the other on grounds that it might give them some marginal advantage. It's simply not working. And I do hope that we'll see a change of that policy soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Matlock, for that fascinating talk that took us back to those very interesting and tumultuous times that were the end of the Cold War and brought us up to the current state of affairs in international relations. We have a series of questions that have been posted that I will read to you. The first question wants to know a little bit more about the role that Europe could have played. So what should Europe have done at the end of the Cold War to better facilitate that transition? And what can Europe do now?
That's a very good question. I think what we had an opportunity to do with the leadership of the United States was to encourage a security system in Europe that included all the countries of Europe and specifically Russia. And I think that could have been done. Instead, we simply continued the policies of the past. And when we got democratic governments in Eastern Europe, then their biggest task was changing the economies, because the communist economy was had to be changed. The command economy with the government running everything, even setting prices and so on, this wasn't working. And therefore there needed to be a transition which was going to be painful, because when you go from one system to another, and go from the communist system to capitalism and free enterprise, it's like changing a submarine to an airplane. And if you need to keep it operating all the time and you've got to use the same crew, that's the task. In other words, this was an important task that had to be done. In the case of Germany, they put billions into the East German economy to bring them around. So I think to do that, you needed to stop thinking in terms of the military, because once you start expanding a military alliance, the people left out are going to feel threatened, and that's going to get very much in the way of the economic and political changes that are necessary for a democratic society to work. So that was the reason I advised strongly against expanding NATO, because, and second, I think it was a big mistake for the United States to insist upon a commanding role in Europe. We should have gradually pulled out and let the West Europeans and all of the Europeans, if you have erased those things, from working out these problems, probably peacefully, but by increasing the military element, you not only take over resources, you make the economic problems more difficult, it becomes us versus them. And if they think you're are actually threatening their existence, as many do now, say in Russia, then you get the sort of situation we have today. I would add that Russia made several suggestions when Medvedev was president for a European security system, which we simply ignored. Oh yeah, well, yeah, that's difficult. You're too big. You've got a different culture.
So there was thank you for that very thorough answer. If only we could go back sometimes to make different decisions, one asks. A question from the audience wants to know what makes Putin seriously think that NATO would attack Russia?
I don't, in Putin's eyes, NATO and giving both arms and, it turns out, clandestine support for those forces in the Donbass, which were dug in, and supporting the attempt of the Ukrainians to solve that problem by force. He clearly psychologically, and stated this repeatedly, that he considered this attack on Russia's vital interests. And there's no question that in the Trump administration, we started supplying offensive weapons and trainers, some of them on Ukrainian soil. Earlier, we had been directly involved in a coup d'etat, which removed an elected leader. And I ask you, how would we react if a hostile military alliance, say China 20 years from now, starts trying to change the government in Mexico and put in one favorable to China? Would we react? I think we have an answer. We have an answer in our last dealings. For example, we know what happened when Khrushchev put nuclear weapons on Cuba. By the way, that did not violate international law. We had weapons in Turkey that could reach them. But we reacted because we considered it an unacceptable threat, and we were right to do so. So I think if you say that if anything remotely comparable to what we were doing in Ukraine happened to any country bordering on us, or in the Caribbean, or even in South America, because we have our sphere of influence in the entire Western Hemisphere, which, with the expansion of NATO, we're expanding to virtually all of Europe. Is it really that difficult to put yourself in the other guy's shoes? By the way, I would say this is something that President Reagan was able to do, because what he wanted to know most when we were developing a strategy for ending the Cold War was, how do I deal with the Soviet leaders? What makes Gorbachev tick? Where's he coming from? So what have we been doing? Just, I would say we've demonized the Russian leader, then one can say maybe he deserves it. But if you look at the steps he has taken, because he did move from an ally of the United States after 9/11 to one who feels that the United States is out to get him. And that is not a total illusion, because a lot of people in that position would read our actions exactly that way.
A follow-up question based on your response. There's a question from the audience that I'll add to. What can the United States do now to work towards a more peaceful solution to the current conflict in Ukraine? And my follow-up to that is, should we follow the example of France and President Macron, who's trying to negotiate and keep an open line of communication? Is that the proper strategy?
Yes, my answer to the second is yes, that's precisely what we should be doing. We should be encouraging a negotiation, even if it means the cession of some of the Ukrainian territory to Russia, given everything that has happened. Because neither side is going to sort of reach these maximum goals. And a continuation of the killing is simply going to do more damage and make the future peace, if it ever comes, more difficult. We have to, and you know, the irony is that from 2014 and the coup d'etat that brought on the current government, our position in my mind should have been that Ukraine should have accepted and abided by the agreement, the so-called Minsk agreement, whereby the violence would stop in the east. They would adopt a federal system, would then give autonomy to the Donbass. Now, that was an agreement that Ukraine actually signed, and Britain and France, and we approved it but didn't sign it. Our position should have been then, you implement that and we will give you aid, economic. You don't implement it, then you're on your own. And because that would have prevented the war altogether. Instead, we step by step began to try to help Ukraine reach a military solution, which, given the forces there, really was never going to be possible. And the idea that they were ever going to return Crimea, which they would not have taken if we had assured them that Ukraine will not be a member of NATO. And I would say now, of course, the irony here is that with the invasion, Ukraine is virtually a de facto member of NATO, given our policies, because we are at war with Russia in every respect except the actual use of American troops overtly in Ukraine. And we don't call them wars anymore. And we ridicule the idea that Putin didn't call it a war, but a military operation. And I would remind Americans that we have not fought a legal war since World War II. Every time we've invaded another country or used military action, we've used other words. And the Congress has not declared war. And yet we are in effective war in many ways. Now, this worries me as one who believes that the Constitution is a very valuable thing, and for Congress to simply opt out of its responsibility for declaring war or not, handing the decision entirely to the president. is a very dangerous precedent. We can talk about other countries being authoritarian, but we have come to the point that the American president, given the attitudes of both parties and Congress, in effect has given a blank check to recent American presidents to wage war whenever they decide.
We have time. We have about 4 minutes left, 5 minutes left. So we have time for a couple more questions, maybe. Another question from the chat asks about Ukrainian citizens' rights and says that polls have suggested that there's far less support for Russia in Ukraine by Russian speakers than there was before the war. What rights do the Ukrainians have vis-a-vis Russian perceptions of security?
I'm sure that a lot of Russian-speaking Ukrainians have been very damaged by the war. Frankly, I think under situations at this time, it's very, very difficult. There will be so many conflicting claims. There is so much propaganda out there. Both the Russians and the Ukrainians are masters at propaganda. And I love both countries. I love both. I know both languages. I don't speak Ukrainian fluently, but I can read it. And every time when I was ambassador, I had speeches in Ukraine. I did them in the Ukrainian language. But it does seem to me that the idea that has started in the West that you could only be a loyal Ukrainian if you spoke only Ukrainian and to the point of even pressure on people to change their name, to give it, if it seemed to be too Russian, to give it a Ukrainian form. This is getting at very basic matters, because I think that the Russian-speaking people in Ukraine, most of them consider themselves Ukrainian. And I would ask those, what if Ireland had said, oh, you can't speak English and be a loyal Irishman, you've got to speak Celtic? Would they have a successful independence? So that I do not know. I'm sure many people have changed their minds. My guess is that most people, most in the Donbass, would say what I think one lady said when she was asked a few years ago about this, whether she wanted to be in Russia or Ukraine. She said, I don't care as long as they stop fighting. And I suspect that a lot would feel that way. But when it comes to an area like Crimea, I think that there was never a predominant feeling that they were Ukraine. That's for a couple of centuries. They were a part of Russia. And there were very few Ukrainian speakers there. But what makes that particularly sensitive for Russia is that it has its major naval base, and one that historically it has defended. Leo Tolstoy, the great writer, was an artillery captain in the Battle of Sevastopol when the British and French attacked. These have things, and I think we Americans should remember, how did we get Texas? Remember that the Mexicans had attacked the Alamo, and so we go to war with Mexico. We take Texas and New Mexico and Arizona as a result of that war. So countries do these things. But the point is, of course, a lot of people are changing their minds one way or the other. But I suspect that in reality, most would say, you know, just stop fighting, for goodness sakes, because it's getting us nowhere. It's just getting more people killed, more things damaged. And if the Russian government perception is that this is attacking their their vital interests, and certainly the United States in a comparable situation would interpret it as a vital interest. That's something we have to remember. And of course, Putin exaggerates a number of things, but to say he lies misplaces it, because he's telling you what he really believes. And people act on their perceptions, not on some theory somewhere. But frankly, my care is for the people in both countries. They are both losing terribly from this, and I don't like to see our government exploiting it. Which
What
I'm
one
afraid
final
looks like to
sorry.
do. Yes.
Sorry to have interrupted you.
Yeah.
One final question then. What can everyday people like us do? What role can we play in potentially promoting peace? Is there anything that citizens can do?
I think it's really very difficult when the government seems to be set in a given course. I was in the government during the war in Vietnam. And I remember that as a government official, though I was hoping the war would end, I very much resented the demonstrations and so on. I think the problem is that we are so wrapped up in our own, dare I call it, political games at home, that most people are not really paying much attention. And most Americans really live in the present. They're not very good at looking at the details of history. And of course, we all have a lot of cares that are not connected with foreign policy, getting through the pandemic and dealing with the economic. But I do think that educating ourselves about the background of these problems, and in particular, given some thought as to how we somehow weaken the grip of what can only be called the congressional military industrial complex. Because the will to try to solve problems by building up the military, building up the force, and the amount of our economy that is now dependent upon the defense budget, all those high-paying jobs. And yet we are running for tremendous deficits. And I would say that, every cent of those billions that we're putting into Ukraine now, mostly in arms, we are borrowing, and not from Americans, but from others. These are off budget and have increased it. And so instead of keeping our rail system safe and so on, we are producing more and more arms to send to wreak destruction elsewhere. There's something wrong there. And I think that people, until we start thinking about it and really bringing some pressure to bear on our representatives and our senators this this is likely to continue.
Well, thank you for a very interesting talk, but also a stimulating question and answer session. Thank you for joining us from your home on the East Coast in our sunny Southern California venue. We were honored to have you for the Hal Smith Lecture Series.
Well, thank you for the invitation, and I hope to come out sometime and visit again.
We hope we'll have you out to talk about the peace process or the end of the conflict sometime very
Okay.
soon.
Yeah.
Thanks to all of you who attended the talk. I apologize for not getting to all of the questions, but to respect time, we were a few minutes over. And so I hope to hear from you about your thoughts on the presentation. And thank you again, Ambassador Matlock.
Thank you. Thank you.